Well, to discuss the G7 meeting, let's bring in our panel. Here with us in the studio, Harlan Ullman is a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council. Also with us, Garret Martin is a lecturer at the School of International Service from the American University. From Chapel Hill, Klaus Larres is a professor of international affairs at the University of North Carolina. And Qinduo Xu is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, joining us from Beijing. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Garret, let me start with you. The summit, of course, discussed a whole host of issues, the trade war between China and the United States, the Iranian nuclear issue. They also discussed a new digital tax on internet companies like Facebook. But, looking at the news conference on Monday morning, there were no announcements on concrete decisions that have been taken that would tell us, we've made a decision on this, we're going to implement this starting tomorrow. So I guess the question is, what did this summit achieve?
Well, I think the most important thing that the summit achieved, really, from the perspective of all the other leaders bar Donald Trump, was that there wasn't a repeat of the dispute of the discord that was very public last year in Canada. So I think it was very clear and very apparent that all the other countries bar the United States were keen to handle Donald Trump and avoid that kind of, at least, public dispute. Behind the scenes, we've had contradictory reports. There were certainly disagreements. I think it was an important decision also by President Macron of France to basically forego the tradition of having a joint statement. Again, I think that was to minimize what happened last year. I think the downside of doing that is that every country can put on their spin and believe that they've achieved what they've claimed to achieve. And we've seen a lot of contradictory views on, for instance, the issue of Iran. We've seen contradictory views on China, on North Korea. So I think we're probably left with a very confusing summit at the end of the day.
So if the primary focus of the summit was to placate Donald Trump to make sure that he doesn't walk out of the summit, are these summits really relevant anymore?
I think that's a very good question. I think for the 45 years history of the G7, it's certainly one of the most challenging times. But in many respects, the G7 reflects the disarray or the challenges that we're facing in the broader international order. The G7 are more divided than they've probably ever been. But I think it's also fair to say that this was a difficult circumstance because aside from Shinzo Abe of Japan, all the leaders were in a difficult position, either facing re-election very soon, whether it's Justin Trudeau in Canada, Donald Trump pretty soon, Angela Merkel is toward the end of her reign, President Macron has some domestic challenges. It was always going to be difficult, not to mention Boris Johnson, it was always going to be difficult for these leaders to reach any agreement.
Right, we'll get to Boris Johnson in a moment, but let me go to Qinduo Xu in Beijing. And Qinduo, China, of course, is not a member of the G7, but it was front and center when you listened to that news conference, the trade war between the US and China being discussed by the leaders. President Trump, for his part, he repeatedly said that China is the country that really wants a deal. Let's listen.
They want to make a deal. I have great respect, and I have great respect for President Xi. And I think we're going to have a deal because now we're dealing on proper terms. They understand and we understand. But that's a great thing that happened. And they want to get something done. Now, maybe it won't get done, but this is the first time I've seen them where they really do want to make a deal.
So, Qinduo Xu, how would this summit be seen in Beijing?
Well, since the very beginning of the trade conflicts, China has expressed its desire to solve this problem by reaching a deal. I think that's obviously a very genuine concern for the Chinese side. It has remained unchanged. But the problem is there's predictability on the U.S. side. There's back and forth in their positions. And also, there's a hard line taken by the Trump administration in terms of trade with China. So it has been in negotiation for a long time, but we haven't achieved much. For the Chinese side, the position is very clear. Even today, they want to have a deal through consultation, as said by Vice Premier Liu He. The thing is, what China is fighting against is really about whether there is a sincere respect for the sovereignty of China. When it comes to some of the clauses in the possible agreement, a possible trade deal, that is related to Chinese sovereignty, Chinese like Chinese lawmaking even. So there is a problem, a degree, to what a degree the Chinese side will accept. And I think they are trying to convey the message that, yes, we want a deal, let's sit down, let's continue the discussion, but you have to respect us.
Right, and Qinduo, I was wondering, listening to that news conference there in Biarritz this morning, which country is more desperate for a deal? Is it President Trump, who tells us it's China that really wants a deal, or is it China? Of course, President Trump is facing an election next year, so is the pressure on him?
My question?
Yes, Qinduo, go ahead.
Well, I think of course the Chinese economy is suffering from the trade conflicts, the trade war, but also remember the U.S. economy is also being affected. But at the same time, remember there's a 2020 election upcoming for President Trump, not for President Xi Jinping. So you see who is desperate. It's very clear.
Okay, Klaus Larres, the Europeans, of course, have a very different view of this trade war. Here's the French president, who is also the G7 host, Emmanuel Macron, talking. Let's watch this.
First of all, to convince our partners that tensions, particularly trade tensions, are bad for everyone. We must succeed in having a form of de-escalation, that is, to stabilize things and avoid this trade war that is taking hold everywhere.
So that was the French President Emmanuel Macron, Klaus. And we also heard from the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who said that Trump's use of tariffs as a, quote, political instrument could cause a global recession. How big or how deep are these differences between President Trump and his G7 partners?
Well, they're very deep. I mean, the G7 summit papered over these difficulties. Everyone was superficially very nice. No one misbehaved. And it was, at least on the surface, a very constructive summit, not least because of the invitation of the Iranian foreign minister. But deep down, all the European leaders are very worried about Donald Trump. They're very worried about the continuing Chinese-American trade conflict. And they're very deeply worried that the trade conflict between the European Union and the United States, who at present is on hold, that conflict will flare up again. And the tariffs on cars were postponed in May. They will be revisited in November. And Trump said today at the news conference that he may not put tariffs on car imports from Europe. But Merkel at that stage looked astonished and, of course, pleased. But this is by no means a foregone conclusion. So the Europeans are deeply worried about both the Chinese-American conflict and about their own trade conflict with the European Union, with the United States.
Right. Harlan, what do you make of this G7 summit? Could it be called a success? Donald Trump didn't walk out earlier, but that's a very low bar, isn't it?
The big winner was Emmanuel Macron, who tried very, very hard to take on two of the big three issues. China, obviously, and getting Trump at least to moderate his views was a step forward. Second, I think having Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, come to the conference was a really very, very, very good idea, because I think it set in stark perspective that the Europeans and the other signatories to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that would have prevented Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon are really very, very worried about the Trump strategy, or the lack of strategy here. And of course, the environmental issues were finessed. Trump didn't even bother to go to that particular session. However, I think that whatever success there was for the G7 summit, tomorrow it will be gone. Nobody knows what Donald Trump is going to do. He can easily reverse his stance and say, look, what I really meant was that China has to do A, B, C, and D, and unless Iran does the following, there's not going to be a negotiation. So I think that the nature of Donald Trump's personality, his unpredictability, and his volatility really will determine whether or not there was anything that was going to come out of this particular summit. And I fear, given his past performance and the way that he changes his positions to conform with his opinions, which seem to be rock hard, even though his principles may be subject to some variance, I'm not sure that very much is going to come out. And I fear that all these underlying tensions and pressures that exist, not only between the G7 and other people, but you've got so many flashpoints around the globe right now. Jammu, Kashmir, India, Pakistan, what's happening in the Middle East with Iran, Venezuela, so forth. This is the end of August. Remember August 1914. I'm not expecting an explosion like that, but there are a lot of potential explosive points here that could come apart if we're not careful.
And Harlan, I'm just wondering, on that point of inviting Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, to France, what message did that send to the United States? Because the foreign minister was actually the target of U.S. personal sanctions imposed on him just about a week or two ago.
There was a combination of French subtlety and French directiveness. In case of the subtlety, it was a sort of surprise that Zarif was there. But in terms of the direction and the absolute 2x4 against the eyeballs, the point was, look, this is serious. Zarif is here. We really think that we have to do something because we think that this issue with Iran is going to be very, very dangerous. That was the message.
Him being there was a violation of those measures that the United States had undertaken.
Not really. He was free to go to those countries, and France is not going to do anything to...
But it did say if he goes to a third country, that country will be sanctioned.
I think Donald Trump will give France a pass on that particular case.
Okay. Garret, I want to continue and focus on specifically the Iran nuclear deal. This is what President Trump said. Let's watch this.
I have to say the JCPOA was a bad deal, should not have been entered into. And I really believe that those countries that went into the original deal, that more and more are agreeing with what I did. But I think those countries are going to be saying thank you someday. I hope they're going to be saying, including France, including the president, because I think we did the right thing.
So, Garret, one day Europe's going to thank Donald Trump. Do you see that happening?
Well, you know, surprising things have happened, so you can never say never. Yeah. But I would be skeptical, because I think you always have to remember that the JCPOA, whether you criticize it or not, was a product of 12 or 13 years of European persistence. I mean, those negotiations started back in 2002, 2003. So really, for the Europeans, it's their signature achievement. So recognizing they were wrong would be very surprising. And so we can see that. I think there was also multiple messages. I agree with a lot with what Harlan said. But I think it was important also for the French to bring up the Iranian issue, where at least amongst the big three in Europe, the French, the Germans, and the English, oh, the UK, sorry, there's certainly agreement. So I think they were wary as well of, you know, Boris Johnson cozying up too much to Donald Trump.
Right. And can I make a point here?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I don't believe Donald Trump or his team have read the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, period. Because if you read it, if all sides are in agreement, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, period, end of story. Now, if some side decides that it's going to abrogate the agreement, I understand. But the way that agreement was written, Iran, if it abided by it, would never, ever have a nuclear weapon. And unless the Trump administration appreciates that, we're never going to get any kind of an agreement with them.
Well, the problem is that the Trump administration...
But isn't the point,
Sorry, go ahead, Klaus.
Yeah, isn't the point that the agreement with Iran wasn't negotiated by Donald Trump himself? I mean, the whole thing reminds me of the NAFTA negotiations. We had new NAFTA negotiations which came to a successful conclusion, but they were very similar to the agreement negotiated by the Obama administration. Something similar may happen with Iran, that we will get a new agreement in a year's time negotiated by Donald Trump, but it will look very much like the 2015 agreement, though of course Trump will sell it as something brilliant and something totally new. And I think something along these lines will happen, that we are moving towards a new nuclear agreement with Iran gradually and slowly, but it will very much look like the 2015 agreement.
Hope springs eternal.
Right. The Trump White House says the problem with the current agreement is that it doesn't include things like ballistic missile tests. It also doesn't
include Hezbollah and Iran and what's so-called benign, or I should say, malignant actions on their part. That's not the issue. Question very simply, do you want Iran to have a nuclear weapon or not? Yes or no? If the answer is no, the JCPOA would have worked. And I think the issue was, it was Obama's treaty, not Trump's treaty.
Right. I think Klaus got that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, but I will also, I think, mention that I don't disagree necessarily with Klaus's idea, but keep in mind it took 12 years to reach an agreement that was solely on nuclear affairs. So if you know, even as a red line, even as a minimum, you bring in ballistic technology, I mean, that's going to make it even more difficult. And there's a question of trust. I mean, if from the Iranian perspective, if you're the supreme leader in Tehran, do you trust the United States to abide by its agreements on the long term? I'm not convinced that that's the case currently.
Right. The question many people ask, of course, is why get rid of what's there? Why don't you just build on that? which is not something that President Trump was inclined to do. Something else, Garret, I'm going to stay with you for this, and that's Brexit. Not on the agenda officially, but Boris Johnson talked about it. He was on the beach, actually, in Biarritz, talking about this. Here he is talking about one of the most contentious issues in the current withdrawal agreement, which is something known as the backstop. That's the new word in our lexicon, the backstop. These are efforts to prevent a hard border going up between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, of course, which is part of Britain. This is what Boris Johnson said. Let's watch this.
I think that it all depends on our friends, and I think they understand the parameters of where we are. The withdrawal agreement cannot work for the UK. It's been rejected 3 times. It contains terms that are anti-democratic that no country could possibly accept.
What is Boris Johnson's strategy here? I know that's a difficult question, but is he playing chicken here with the European Union, or is he essentially saying, look, I'm quite happy to go with a no-deal Brexit?
Well, first of all, I think Brexit is always on the agenda when you're dealing with the Prime Minister. I think it's a fact of life currently. Yeah. I think it's an excellent question. I think there's a couple of analysts have suggested, and I'm inclined to believe it, that a lot of this is for domestic consumption. You know, Boris Johnson won the leadership race, by taking a harder line than his opponents. Okay, so he's tied to that. I think the gamble he might be trying to do, and we'll see if that happens in the next 2 weeks, is to essentially call a snap election. He called a snap election in early September. It's a gamble. The election would happen sometime in mid-October, before a crucial EU leadership council in mid-October. If his gamble works and he has a bigger majority, that automatically strengthens his negotiating leverage, which was crucially lacking for Theresa May, who was so dependent on the Northern Irish Party in order to pass anything. So that's my guess. It's a domestic gamble, and we've heard certainly reports that Downing Street is on their sort of campaign warpath. So that would certainly add to that element.
Right, Klaus, I'll get to you in a moment, but just one point that you made there, Garret. Increases his negotiating leverage with whom? With his own party or with the European Union?
Well, I think both. Yeah. Both, because let's say he wants to try and pass some kind of slightly modified withdrawal agreements, he would have the votes. The arithmetic was never good for Theresa May, but it also might slightly increase his leverage with the EU 27. That's what Theresa May tried in the spring of 2017 to call a snap election. That backfired spectacularly. Elections are unpredictable. So Boris Johnson might be the shortest prime minister if there's an election, or his gamble might work.
Klaus, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, I may disagree with that. I think Boris Johnson is quite serious that he wants to take the UK out of the EU by means of a hard Brexit solution. And then he will have a general election, because he is a bit like Trump. He wants to run on a platform that he promised something like a hard Brexit, and he fulfilled it. And then he will go to the electorate and say, you see, I'm a successful prime minister. I did what I promised, and now you can vote for me and trust me. And I believe he could actually win an election like that. Boris Johnson's ultimate aim is, like Donald Trump's ultimate aim, is to be re-elected and to stay in power as long as possible. All other ways, be it Brexit, be it the economy, is just the means to an end. Boris Johnson wants to stay in power, and I think he has to deliver Brexit first, and then run on the platform of having done what he did, what he promised to do.
Klaus, very quickly, on one point that was made there by Boris Johnson, 2 points he made actually. He said that the backstop is essentially undemocratic and forces Britain to abide by EU rules without getting any of the advantages of EU membership. Does he have a point there?
He does have a point there, but that was agreed in the withdrawal agreement for a negotiated Brexit solution. It is not undemocratic, because both the British and negotiating team and the EU negotiating team agreed with it. So it's a proper international treaty solution which has been achieved. It's not undemocratic, but it will tie the UK and particularly Northern Ireland into an EU framework. In that point, he's right. Yeah.
Okay. Qinduo, I want to get back to a point I raised with Garret right at the beginning of the show, and that was the relevance of the G7. China is not a member of the G7, as I pointed out, yet it is the world's second biggest economy. I mean, is the G7 relevant? Should it be reconfigured right now to include countries like China?
Well, I wouldn't say like China is going to be part of that, but look, the 7 richest countries in the world, but this is not only, we see they are achieving very little. Some people are questioning what's the point of having the gathering influence at all. This is partly because of the division and differences among these nations between the Americans and the Europeans. They are different on the Iranian issue, different on the climate change, on the trade policies, but also because of the rights of the rest of the world. For example, without Russia, without China, India is there, but how can you cope with the issues like climate change? China is playing the leading role, and China is not there. And if you are talking about the trade policies, China is the largest trading nation in the world, and China is not there. So I think this is a reality, but somehow people are trying to avoid that and focusing on, the tradition of the rich nations trying to solve the problem of the world. Unfortunately, they are not able to do that.
Harlan, one point I've got to raise with you before the end of the show, and that is Trump holding out the possibility of readmitting Russia to the G7 and then becoming the G8 again. What's behind that?
Well, I think he wants to play golf with Vladimir Putin in Mar-a-Lago or at Doral. That's a very, very good question. If there were a quid pro quo, that is to say, is there an agreement that could be reached over Ukraine and over Crimea, possibly a new referendum, then perhaps that would be acceptable for a negotiating position. But unfortunately, when Donald Trump has particularly a good idea, and he does have some, the execution becomes almost impossible. So even if bringing Russia back to the G8 could be something that could be feasible, there's no plan, there's no quid pro quo, there's no reason what Russia would have to do. And unless or until we see that, then I think that this is an aspiration that will just offend people. There's a larger issue here. The Trump administration clearly has pulled back on a whole series of alliances. It has downgraded NATO. It has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What it's doing with the G7 and the G20 is to minimize it. And this is relieving and taking out the fundamental building block of international cohesion. I don't like to say America is the leader of the free world. I think it's a bad term. But American participation is critical. And I think what we're seeing in the G7 is a removal of American leadership, which leaves a vacuum. Similarly with Brexit, and I predict Brexit will be bad. If it's a hard landing, it could be the end of the prime ministership of Boris Johnson because of the factions. But in any event, this is a further sign of the erosion of any sort of leadership in the international order. Right. And in those circumstances, one sees far more disruptive tendencies taking place rather than fewer.
So what are your thoughts then, Harlan, on the relevance of an organization like the G7? We often hear people talk about multilateralism, of a rules-based order. None of that's happening.
The UN, NATO, all these organizations could have tremendous impact. The G7, G8 could. Unfortunately, they're not being used as such. And so we are losing an opportunity that may be irreversible. And the question one asks is that what Donald Trump has done so far, is that damage reversible or irreversible? At this stage, I do not know, and not knowing is a serious condemnation of where we're heading.
Klaus, one very quick question. We've got about a minute left, and this was a question that a piece that was in the Guardian newspaper, and it said, looking at alternatives to the current order, it said, quote here, any hopes that Angela Merkel would pick up the baton where American leadership has failed since 2016, at least as a champion for Europe, have proved ill-founded. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, the Europeans are simply not strong enough. Neither Macron nor Angela Merkel nor the entire EU. They are not militarily all that important, neither politically, only economically. But I think, I wouldn't share the pessimism of the other speaker on the G7. I think this year's G7 was relatively successful. We had an initiative on Iran. We had an initiative on climate change. We even had the possibility that it is possible to tame Donald Trump and perhaps convince convince him to engage with China again. So I think today the G7 meeting, or this year the G7 meeting, did not show a lack of leadership. It may not have been the strongest possible G7 meeting, but it's going into the right direction. And it was a more informal meeting, and I think that informality served it well, rather than these very artificial, more formal meetings of the last few years. So I'm slightly optimistic that perhaps in the future the G7 meeting will continue to exercise global leadership.
Wait until Donald Trump's tweet tomorrow, and you may reverse your opinion.
Okay. You may not.
Well, we've got to end the show here. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all for this edition of The Heat, but you can listen to more in our podcast. We'll be covering stories from around the world in a bit more personal and candid manner with our guests and correspondents. And the conversation also continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.